So hello, my name is Chad Briggs. I'm with the University of Alaska Anchorage, and I'm here today with Dr. Miriam Matejova to talk about issues of environmental intelligence, national security, and how we use scenarios and other methods to try to assess environmental risks. So Miriam, if you could please introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having me. My name is Miriam Matejova, and I am currently an economic advisor at Environment and Climate Change Canada, which is Canada's Ministry of the Environment. I'm also a fellow at Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, or NIPSIA, at Carleton University. And I have a PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia. And the most interesting thing about me is that I'm a co-author of this beautiful book, Disaster Security, which is with you, Chad.
It is a great book, so anyone who wants to track it down, and it is on Kindle as well. I wanted to ask you, when we first met, you had separate backgrounds in intelligence studies. In fact, we met at an intelligence conference in Wales, but also had a background in environmental politics. And you really hadn't seen the possibility for developing environmental intelligence as a field. So what really compelled you about that idea? And what did you see challenging about it?
Right, so I mean, I had no idea that you could combine environmental politics and intelligence and security into one before I met you. But so maybe I will kind of go a little bit back to explain why this fascinates me so much. So I studied environmental politics in my undergrad at the University of Northern British Columbia. I studied environmental politics and economics. Economics because my teachers told me that I need to study economics if I want to get a job, which they were right, by the way. But I studied environmental politics because I wanted to know why people are willing to let the environment degrade. That's all I was interested in. I wasn't at the time really interested in solutions. That came later. By the time I got to grad school, I switched from environment to security purely because there were no environmental courses offered at NIPSIA, the Norman Paterson School, where I did my master's. But there are a lot of security and intelligence courses offered, and I happen to also want to know why people fight, why they want to fight, and how to stop them. So I was like, fine, I'll just study security, and I love that. And I kind of forgot about environment until I got a job at Environment Canada in environmental policy. So for a little bit, when I was in grad school, I kind of led this double life of working in environmental policy and studying security and intelligence at the same time. And then I met you at an intelligence conference in Briggs in Wales. I believe that was in 2011.
Yes.
And you told me that there is such a thing as environmental intelligence. And I remember that just blew my mind because I was like, but of course there is, right? It suddenly seemed perfectly possible and plausible, and just it made sense to combine environmental politics and security into one. And I love that because I always wanted to, I have always been interdisciplinary in my learning and later in my research and in my teaching. And I never understood why I have to study one area and not apply that knowledge somewhere else. But sadly, this is how academia works. This is how policy works, right? We have different departments and agencies tasked with just one particular area of, environment or like defense or whatever. And they often don't talk or don't know how to talk to different agencies or departments. And we have the same in academia with not just departments, but with, studying different fields and subfields. You're either a security scholar, you're environmental politics scholar, or you're a political economist. So you can't be all, or it's not encouraged to be all. And I always had a problem with that. So like combining environment and security is just this creates these beautiful opportunities to take one way of thinking from, let's say, security studies and apply them in an area that's different but can benefit from that kind of thinking, right? Like the approach of studying uncertainty, for example, can be applied in environmental studies to solve environmental problems. So anyway, I just feel that combining the two really opens up opportunities to thinking outside of the box and to solve problems that otherwise we would never think of solving or wouldn't know how to solve, right? So anyway, sorry, that was a little
No, it's fine. And I might need to explain to some people. At the time, my wife and I were working with the Air Force. We were based in London. And then shortly after that, we transferred to Ottawa, which is coincidentally where Miriam was living. So Miriam got to meet Tracy and became involved in our work as a volunteer, not like working directly for the Air Force and Canadian government at the same time. And our approach was often to use scenarios to try to create ideas about what was going to possibly happen in the future. And we had a couple of efforts to do that in Canada, specifically the International Polar Year, which was in Montreal in 2012. And shortly after that, I'd been invited to return to Ukraine. I'd originally started working in Ukraine the year before. I couldn't go because of conflicts, so I sort of said, well, hey, I have this colleague who could go in my place, and so sent Miriam instead. Could you just describe what those experiences were like what those events were like? Because, you know, I'd always seen them from my perspective and from Tracy's perspective, but, and then your Ukraine experience, I think, was very different as well.
Yes, so the two were actually completely different, like opposites, almost opposites. So yes, so both of them, I think the two workshops, the one in Montreal and in Kiev, were about a month apart, I think, if I remember correctly. And the one in Montreal was first. And that was my first time facilitating or seeing these scenario workshops and facilitating them. And I remember it was very intimidating. I remember there were, I think, about 3 or 4 groups of people around tables. And there are groups of people that I never met before. I think I had a couple of friends facilitating as well, but we were not together on the table. So I found it very difficult to essentially tell people with different experiences, different expertise actually, and credentials. I found it difficult to tell them what to do. I like telling people what to do. I remember I was intimidated by that. And perhaps the most difficult thing was to get them to do the exercise, right? So the idea was to randomly pick 4 drivers, environmental hazards, combine them together, get the people to create scenarios that were plausible, and combine the 4 drivers into some meaningful narratives. And I found it very difficult for them, like to push people to do that, because sometimes you get these random cards of events that just don't make any sense together, like, you know, solar flares and depletion of global fisheries, right? How are you going to combine the two? And people didn't want to do that, right? They were like, oh, we can't do this, and it just doesn't work. And often later I found, and even in that Montreal workshop, I found them just push people a little bit and just tell them, okay, well, if it really doesn't work, I'll give you a different driver, but let's try first. So once they get over that idea that no, we can't do that because it makes no sense, they actually can put them together later on and create these narratives. So that is the main thing I remember from Montreal. The Kiev conference was probably one of the most memorable ones I've ever been to. It was mostly attended by, I think, Ukrainians and Russians. I was certainly the only Canadian in there, and at the time I was still working for the government, so people thought that I was there as a government representative, which I wasn't. But I got a lot of nice treatment, which I liked. Doing workshops with those participants, and they were mostly students, was challenging, not because, like, I wasn't intimidated I wasn't worried about telling them what to do. But it was really hard to get them to talk and to participate. It's much less it was much less interactive. It's difficult to kind of drag opinions and ideas and arguments out of a crowd like that. But in the end, when we actually did the process of scenario creation, it was the same process. I got really surprised because the students, like they're mostly students, they got really into it, and they started talking, and they started talking to each other, and they started talking to me, and and they weren't afraid, by the way, of just putting random things together. We didn't have that problem in there. They just got right into it and created the narratives, and they didn't stop there, actually. And this is something that didn't happen in Montreal, but it happened in Kiev, that my group specifically created a scenario, and I can't remember what it was anymore. It was something catastrophic, of course. That's what they are meant to be. And they created a catastrophic scenario, and then they said, okay, let's find solutions. And that wasn't plan of that workshop. I just wanted them to create these narratives and, like, you know, be scared. But they were like, no, let's create solutions, and they did that. And I thought that was really great. And then they came back to me later on, and they said that was wonderful, and they were very happy, and that's very unusual.
I remember you sent back photos, and I was just shocked at the body language, because it was not typical for a group of Russians and Ukrainians to look like that around a table.
Yeah, they were very kind of leaning in and smiling, and they had a lot of fun. Well, we had a lot of fun. I did too. But really, what really surprised me was the fact that they didn't care that it was difficult or it was unrealistic. They were like, okay, well, now we have this problem, and let's see what we can do and how we can plan for it. So that was really cool.
And I should point out that helped pave the way for a war game that I ran in Kiev about 2 years later, just shortly after the Russian invasion of Crimea. And credit to Tatiana Magarenko, who helped set up both of those events. I also want to talk about your research. So, you mentioned the book, which is great, and everyone should read it.
It's pretty.
You incredibly were writing this with me at the same time you're writing your own dissertation, which I can't even imagine.
Yes.
So can you talk
I
a little?
I didn't tell my supervisor until after it was done. She wasn't happy.
No. As a PhD supervisor, I wouldn't have suggested that either. But your dissertation was also about disasters, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm, yes.
So could you describe it a little?
Yes. So I wanted to write a dissertation about disasters before I started my PhD. So Canadian PhD programs are much the same as American PhD programs, that you go in and then you don't have to know for a couple of years what you want to write your dissertation on, and then kind of do coursework and then find your topic. And I knew that I wanted to write about disasters. I just didn't know what exactly I wanted to do. But because I was in political science program, I had to write a dissertation that was a political science dissertation. So I don't want to say less practical, but more academic. So this book is very practically oriented. We did write it for both academic audiences and policy audiences and practitioners, right? We wanted to write a book that was about planning for disasters and anticipating events that are unexpected. I couldn't do that in my dissertation, and I tried. My supervisor had this practice of having me write one-pagers of topics, and then he would just reject them. And he rejected, I think, 4 of them until until he found one that he liked. And that's the one that I ended up writing on. So what I was looking at actually in my research, in my doctoral research, was social impacts of industrial disasters. Specifically the social impacts of the environmental damage that follows very large industrial disasters, such as oil spills, like tanker oil spills, mine leaks, and nuclear accidents. And what I mean by social impact is people's reaction to these disasters. So I noticed that after some of the largest industrial environmental disasters, nothing really happened when it comes to people's reactions. So some of them were followed by protests, such as the Deepwater Horizon spill or Fukushima nuclear accident, but most, in fact, were not. Most of these large damaging industrial environmental disasters were not followed by any kind of expression of public outrage. And I found that surprising and puzzling. And so I wanted to know why. So I structured my dissertation into kind of these somewhat separate chapters investigating different factors that would motivate or enable people to protest after large industrial environmental disasters. So I looked at structural conditions. This is all in rich industrialized democracies. So I looked at economic conditions, at state repression, environmental grievances, environmental culture. So trying to see if any of those structural conditions would have any effect on people's willingness to protest after disasters. Then I look at geographical factors, environmental damage, proximity to disasters, stuff like relatability as well, like how do these things influence people's willingness to protest. And then the one thing that motivated me from our work, Chad, one thing that I brought from our work into my dissertation is this focus on uncertainty. So uncertainty in political science is very much, or mostly studied as some kind of a background condition. Not as a condition that interacts and shapes actors or political actors' interests and identities, behavior, but it's something that's simply there and people have to deal with it or not, right? We tend to avoid it. And we tend to avoid it in research as well. But I wanted to know whether uncertainty actually has an effect on people, whether it shapes people's action in any significant way. So I took that idea of disaster uncertainty and I ran an experiment to see whether uncertainty surrounding environmental disasters would actually has any effect on people's willingness to participate in political actions such as protest. And it does, but under certain conditions, not on its own actually. So anyway, so my dissertation is kind of this patchwork of individual yet connected chapters, trying to shed some light on why people, not why they care about the environmental damage from disasters, but why they take that extra step and try to do something about it.
Yeah, I do know the difficulty of trying to write, something that's supposed to be practical in a dissertation setting. I mean, and my dissertation at Carleton ended up being a patchwork of geography and public administration and philosophy of science. And I'm surprised it passed in the end in the political science department. But we've gotten back to work since then on issues of disaster intelligence and environmental intelligence. Mm-hmm. And from the perspective now of someone who's in the US during this coronavirus pandemic and everything we're seeing about how the US is really just, to be honest, failing with this disaster across the board. Not necessarily at the state and local levels, some states, but the US used to be a real leader in environmental security and environmental intelligence, and now it's just disappeared. Some of the programs have disappeared, the political trust and capital have been lost. One thing we mentioned, and I just want to turn this to you, like what are the opportunities for smaller countries like Canada, for example, in leading on environmental intelligence? Because it's something we've discussed, but I think it needs to be emphasized a bit more.
Yes, right. I often pause when somebody says that Canada is a small country. Because...
Well, I mean, compared to the US in terms of resources, like when I used to work for the Department of Energy, I had to explain to people that the US Department of Energy has as many employees as the entire Canadian federal government. And so in terms of scale, yeah, they are different.
Yeah, because I always imagine the geography, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah, of course.
Not a small country, but actually, the geography actually I think is a huge advantage when it comes to Canada's leadership in environmental intelligence or environmental policy. I forgot to say, by the way, I introduced myself as a public servant, but this is all my opinions. I'm not representing Canadian federal government in here right now. I forgot to say that. I'm obligated to say that.
No, I think you said it, but we'll just emphasize it.
Okay. But anyway, so I do think that actually Canada's size is a huge advantage, and not just size, it's the diversity of the landscape, right? So the Arctic, the rainforest, the prairies, the lakes, the Atlantic coast, because there's such a diversity of landscape, there are many different research opportunities, and there are pockets of research everywhere in Canada, whether it's in academia or in public service, provincial and federal governments. And there's great environmental research going on. The problem is that it's very disconnected, and it's disconnected, I want to say, across universities, but very much so between public service and academia, or between policy and academia. And this is something that I struggled with the first time when I worked for the government. This is something I struggle with now, that it's difficult to communicate research findings, and so for academics, for researchers and scientists, it's really difficult to communicate their findings. But for policymakers, it's difficult to communicate, hey, this is what we want you to do, or this is what we need your research for. So now, actually, I realize that now I'm talking about disadvantages rather than advantages, not answering the question properly. But so what I'm trying to say is that Canada has immense potential in creating information and creating data and collecting data, processing it into, making it into meaningful information that could be used for meaningful environmental policies. And if Canada could harness it, then it would be much easier for Canada to become a bigger environmental leader. And then the next step would be to kind of create more networks of experts and practitioners and policymakers, and then kind of project that image out into the international. So I think that the foundation is already in there when it comes to the data and the information. Now it's just more about networking and communication, and like at both actually domestic and international level.
Yeah, and I'd say those networks are really the important thing. The US still has many of the experts it had before, but if the politics breaks down, if the public trust, if people don't trust the institutions that were set up, then that's a real problem. People don't trust necessarily the CDC anymore for certain issues because of, it's been politicized. Yeah. And so, yeah, I think one of the points we were trying to make was that for environmental intelligence, it's the networks, these international networks of scientists that are really important. And you know, I've had colleagues set up attempts at online networks in the past, and maybe that's something that we have to return to now in this sort of new normal pandemic where we're all on video meetings all day.
And it's actually, this is something that's really important. You mentioned the issue of trust. And I think that in Canada, like there's certainly the polarization. We don't see that polarization in Canada, certainly not in the same way as in the United States. We have different, I think we have polarization along different issues, right? Like, for example, in here, it's not, like, nobody really is denying climate change. But there's a huge divide between natural resource development and environmentalism. So like the debates are a bit different, and subsequently the trust, or the issue of trust, is a little bit different. So you know, like the oil patch workers probably don't have a lot of trust in Environment Canada, but it's, yeah. Anyway, so it's really important. I think Canada is just set up differently, and it does have the potential again to develop those networks a little bit more, and to reach across some of the divides.
Yeah, I just always have to put in my piece once in a while to policymakers in Ottawa that, you know, it takes just a little investment. You could do this.
Yeah. It takes just to talk, you know, like it just start talking, but not just to talk. Like, it's about listening. It's about the communication is just crucial, but not just talking and listening to.
Well, I want to thank you. It's always great working with you. It's I'm really glad that you had a chance to come to Alaska in February, just before everything started closing down, and could actually see everything. So hopefully we'll see each other again in person sometime soon.
I hope so. We have to do another workshop.
Yes, we certainly will. All right. Thank you so much, Miriam. And I'll put some links to some of our work on the video link below. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you.
Bye.